Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Josh and this is Practical Apologetics. Today I want to talk about Papal Infallibility and share one of the main reasons why I personally can't accept this doctrine. First, let me be clear up front. I'm not here to attack our Catholic friends or say that they aren't Christians. Many Catholics love Jesus deeply and are sincere in their faith. I just want to explain my perspective honestly and ask what I think is an important historical question. Catholics often point to passages like Luke chapter 22 verse 32 as one of the primary biblical texts supporting the doctrine of papal infallibility, where Jesus tells Peter, "I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." See, Catholics understand this and other passages as evidence that Christ gave Peter and his successors a unique and infallible teaching authority in the church. I understand that claim, even if I don't personally agree with it. However, when we look at church history, we find several cases that raise difficult questions. The most famous example is Pope Irenaeus I in the 7th century. Irenaeus supported a teaching known as monothelitism, and he was later condemned by name by the Third Council of Constantinople all the way back in 681. Now, Catholics are quick to point out that Irenaeus was not speaking ex cathedra, and I understand that response. But Irenaeus is not the only example that raises questions throughout church history. There have been other instances where popes appeared to disagree with previous popes, or revised earlier positions, or became the subject of doctrinal controversy. Catholics have responses to these cases as well, and I'm not here trying to debate every individual example in this video. And Irenaeus is not the only reason I struggle with this issue. Even centuries later, Christians were still debating fundamental questions about papal authority itself. During the 15th century, the Church experienced the Western Schism, when multiple men claimed to be the rightful pope. In response, theologians and church councils wrestled with difficult questions about whether a council could have authority over a pope and how the church should resolve disputes involving papal leadership. And they even questioned whether a pope can be wrong at all. The council even declared that a general council derives its authority directly from Christ, and that everyone, including the pope, is bound to obey it in certain matters. So what I find significant is not simply that disagreements existed. What I find significant is that these debates appear to involve fundamental questions about the nature and limits of papal authority itself. If these limitations were already part of the apostolic deposit of faith, then why do we see so much uncertainty and debate over them so many centuries later? All of these examples are generally answered by Catholics in the same way. They say these were not ex cathedra statements. So let's pause and take a moment to define what that actually means. The phrase ex cathedra is a Latin for from the chair. It refers to the Pope speaking officially in his role as the successor of Peter and from the seat of Peter, as the supreme teacher of the Church. According to Catholic teaching, a Pope is not considered infallible every time he speaks, writes, gives an interview, or even publicly teaches. Rather, he is only protected from error when he speaks ex cathedra by formally defining a doctrine concerning faith or morals for the entire church. So my question is not whether Catholics define ex cathedra this way today. I completely understand that they do. My question is actually where we find these specific limitations being clearly taught before they were formally defined at Vatican I in 1870. And that brings me to the real issue and the question I raise. Today, Catholics teach that papal infallibility is very limited. The Pope is only protected from error when he speaks ex cathedra under specific conditions. Those conditions were formally defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870. Catholics would argue that Vatican I did not invent these limitations, but merely clarified that the Church had always believed them. I understand that argument. My question is this: where's the historical evidence that these specific limitations were being taught, though, before the controversies they are now used to explain? And that's really at the heart of my concern. I'm not asking whether modern Catholic theology has an explanation for Irenaeus. I'm asking whether Christians before 1870 were already making these same distinctions. Can we find evidence of any church fathers, councils, canon law, documents, theologians, or papal writings that clearly explain that not every papal teaching is protected from error, and that only certain papal statements meet the criteria for infallibility, just like we saw in 1870? Because if those limitations were truly part of the Church's teaching from the beginning, I would expect them to leave a clear historical trail. After all, Catholicism is one of the most thoroughly documented institutions in human history. We have church fathers, councils, papal letters, theological treaties, canon law, nearly 2,000 years of written documentation. So if these specific conditions were already understood long before Vatican I, then where are they? And here's what makes this especially difficult for me. Irenaeus was condemned in 681, and Vatican I was held in 1870. That's nearly 1,200 years. If the Church already understood these specific limitations on papal infallibility, this seems like the exact moment we would expect those distinctions to be clearly explained. After all, a pope had just been condemned for doctrinal error. Wouldn't people naturally ask how that could happen? And if the answer was that Irenaeus had not spoken ex cathedra, where do we find church leaders clearly explaining that distinction at the time? Where do we find them saying, yes, Irenaeus was wrong, but this does not affect papal infallibility, because only certain papal teachings are protected from error? If those criteria were already well known, where's the documentation showing Christians were appealing to them centuries before Vatican I formally defined them? For example, around the year 180, St. Irenaeus spoke of Rome's authority in very strong terms. In the 5th century, St. Peter Chrysologus wrote about Peter continuing to provide the truth of faith through his successors in Rome. At the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the bishops famously declared, "Peter has spoken through Leo." These are strong statements about Rome and Peter's authority. What I struggle to find are statements that clearly articulate the specific limitations later defined by Vatican I. I don't find church fathers saying things like, the Pope is only infallible under these particular conditions. I don't find detailed explanations distinguishing ordinary papal teaching from infallible papal teaching in the way Vatican I later would. It's striking when you compare this to the apostles themselves. Their personal letters to individuals or specific churches are considered infallible scripture. Yet papal letters and teachings, even to the whole church, require these very narrow conditions to be protected from error. If those sources exist, I would genuinely want to see them. And I want to be fair here. I'm not claiming that Vatican I automatically proves papal infallibility is false. I'm not claiming Catholics are dishonest. I'm simply asking what I believe is a reasonable historical question. If Vatican I merely clarified what the Church had always believed, can someone show me evidence that these specific criteria were clearly taught before the major controversies involving popes arose? Not evidence after Vatican I. Not explanations developed centuries later, but evidence that Christians were already making these distinctions before the controversies occurred. Because when I look at the historical timeline, I see papal controversies first, debates over the limits of papal authority centuries later, and the formal definition of these limitations later still. And that's one of the biggest reasons I imagine many other Protestants, remain unconvinced. Some Protestants have even accused Vatican I of creating these limitations after the fact in order to reconcile these early papal controversies and apparent contradictions. If Catholics can point to clear evidence that these distinctions were already being taught long before those controversies arose, then I think that would go a long way towards vindicating the Church against that accusation. So if you're Catholic and know of sources that address this concern, I genuinely would love to read them. Please put them in the comments below. I read every comment and do my best to respond. Thanks for watching, and God bless.